Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Yes.
We are a few minutes late, but just about to start. I wanted to say hello. I see that you're all here. We are all in chambers, so I will open the meeting right now, actually. I think we're all good to go.
Sounds good.
City of Salem, November 20th, 2023, joint public hearing of the City Council and the Planning Board. A joint public hearing of the Salem City Council and the Planning Board was held remotely on Monday, November 20th, 2023 at 6:30 p.m. and in City Council chambers for the purposes of discussing inclusionary housing zoning ordinance pursuant to Chapter 40, Section 5 of the Massachusetts General Laws. The purpose of the public hearing is to provide interested parties with an opportunity to comment on the proposed zoning ordinance amendment summarized on the next page. We also have backup documentation available for full text. Notice of this hearing was posted on November 2nd, 2023 at 1:47 p.m. and advertised in the Salem News on November 6, 2023 and November 13th, 2023. Absent from the Salem City Council are Councilor Dominguez, and joining us remotely is Councilor Varela. Council President Megan Stott is presiding. And I am going to throw it over to Chair Grissett to open the Planning Board.
Thank you, Madam President. The members of the Salem Planning Board are present, with one exception, Josh Turiel, and I will now call the roll and we can start the meeting. Kurt Reeder.
Present.
Errol Hamilton.
Present.
Sarah Tarbett.
Present.
Helen Sides.
Present.
Thomas Fury.
Present.
Zach Counter.
Present.
Josh Turiel is absent. Jonathan Burke.
Present.
And I, Bill Grissett, am also present. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Madam President.
Thank you, Chair Grissett. Also in attendance here in Council Chambers, we have the Deputy Director of Planning, Amanda Giancola, as well as Elena from the Planning Department joining us, Elena Emmer. And we have joining us online, Alexis Smith from the MAPC as well. This evening, I figured we will start with asking Ms. Giancola to approach the podium and provide an overview of the inclusionary zoning ordinance that we are going to discuss this evening. And then we have a presentation that both Elena and Alexis will walk through for us. Okay, sound good? Councilor McCarthy. Your mic's not on. Sorry. Oh, would you like, so yes, I would also recognize the two elected officials that we have in the chambers this evening. We have Councilor-elect for Ward 1, Miss Cindy Jergolza. Jerzalo, thank you. Gosh, you had to put me on the spot there. Thanks. And Councilor-elect for Ward 4, Mr. Harvey. Thank you. Okay, Amanda?
Hi there, thank you. Again, my name is Amanda Giancola with the Planning Department, and with me tonight is Alexis Smith on Zoom, our consultant with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and Elena Eimer, our senior planner who works on housing policy. Elena is leading our affordable housing efforts, specifically implementing the strategies of our housing roadmap. We have 30 strategies in our roadmap, and this ordinance in front of you tonight is number 12 of those 30. So I just want to note this ordinance alone is not going to solve our housing crisis, but it is one of the important pieces and important strategies that we have outlined in there. So tonight, Elena's going to start and just give an introduction to the background of the ordinance, go through how this ordinance interacts with Section 3A of Mass General Law. That's a new section of Mass General Law, Chapter 40A. And then we're going to hand it over to Alexis, our consultant, to go through the nitty-gritty of the ordinance, key pieces of it, the market analysis associated with it, and then we'd like to have questions at the conclusion of the presentation. With that, I'll hand it over to Elena.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having us tonight. Alexis, oh, wonderful. Next slide, please. Next slide again. So inclusionary housing, this is also commonly referred to as inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary housing is an approach by which developments which are market rate, which means they are not subsidized by public financing, are required to provide a certain number of affordable units at a certain agreed upon level of affordability under 100% of the area median income. The term came about because these affordable units are included within the market rate development. Again, this is also commonly known as inclusionary zoning. Something else that I want to make clear to everyone tonight is this is a fairly common strategy that is used to advance affordable housing goals in the Commonwealth. There's over 100 different municipalities within Massachusetts that have some inclusionary housing element, and that includes near neighbors to Salem like Swampscott, Beverly, Peabody, and Danvers. Next slide, please. And next slide again. So many members of the bodies with us present here tonight and additional interested members of the public know that this is not inclusionary housing's first time before Salem City Council. In fact, there was a recent effort that spanned 2019 and 2020. In February 2020, a proposed inclusionary housing ordinance was introduced that had a significant financial feasibility analysis that was completed as part of that effort. That was also completed by MAPC, the same consultant that joins us on this effort. The ordinance failed in that previous consideration by one vote. That effort and this effort both require a supermajority vote of council for adoption. And the housing roadmap that was subsequently completed in 2022 and adopted by City Council called out inclusionary housing as a strategy worth revisiting because they saw its value as one component of advancing affordable housing in the city. Next slide, please. And again. Oh, beautiful, Alexis. So as Amanda sort of previewed for us, this inclusionary housing effort doesn't exist in a vacuum. The City of Salem has also been asked to comply with the MBTA Communities Law, which is also commonly referred to as Section 3A. The MBTA Communities Law was passed in January of 2021. It requires that all municipalities in the Commonwealth that have transit stops or adjacent to communities that have them to establish a district of a reasonable size located near those transit stations in which multifamily housing is allowed by right. And that means there's no special permit process attached to that. MBTA communities, this is a really crucial point, MBTA communities are required to zone for a certain multifamily capacity. This is not a mandate to build. Cities do not build housing. Failure to comply with the MBTA communities law would put a municipality at risk of liability under state and federal fair housing laws, as well as making that municipality ineligible for certain state funds. Next slide, please. So what does that mean when we look at the Salem context? Salem is a commuter rail community. That's a designation made by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, which is sort of the adjudicating state body for compliance with the MBTA Communities Law. That is obviously because we have the benefit of commuter rail service here in the City of Salem. In January 2023, the City of Salem applied for interim compliance, which was granted to us in March 2023. That interim compliance included the City of Salem sketching out how we would ensure compliance with the overall laws and its requirements. In May of this year, the city submitted for our final determination. We submitted that the existing central business district, the B5, is already compliant. And so we do not believe that the city will need to pursue a rezoning to establish compliance with the MBTA 3A, rather MBTA Communities Law, Section 3A. And I want to be very clear that EOHLC is aware that the City of Salem is considering advancing an inclusionary housing policy, and we've communicated that the elements included in it as well as the draft language. Next slide. And that is relevant because for the purposes of the compliance for purposes of being compliant with Section 3A, As of right zoning means that not more than 10% of affordable units are required to be affordable, and the affordability cannot be lower than 80% AMI. The Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities may approve a greater percentage of affordable units or a deeper affordability level if the applying municipality can provide an economic feasibility analysis that shows that a variety of multifamily housing types can be developed at different affordability levels. Next slide, please. And that's relevant for us tonight because the ordinance that is submitted to City Council does include a consideration for providing no, I guess I'm adding some information as we're going, but the slides have not been updated. This is relevant because the city is looking to, or rather the ordinance that is before City Council includes an affordability level of 60% AMI. So obviously that is below that stated compliance level. However, we have been working with MAPC on an economic feasibility analysis, which would articulate that point that the inclusionary housing policy would not so dampen would not make multifamily development not by right by making it financially infeasible. And in fact, the ordinance that's before you includes carve-out language that excludes the B5 district from inclusionary housing, from implementing the elements of inclusionary housing until such time that we receive approval on that economic feasibility analysis from EOHLC. And also just to thread the final needle, this is not on the slide, but the market analysis that does underpin the inclusionary housing and inclusionary housing ordinance that's before us all that helped to verify the cost offsets that we're going to walk through this evening and the elements of affordability that we are proposing. The economic feasibility analysis was the genesis the economic feasibility analysis was the market analysis that underpins the elements of the inclusionary housing ordinance that's before you were all derived from the economic feasibility analysis. So these are very closely related documents with shared findings. Thanks for your patience on that. Next slide. So as Amanda mentioned earlier, we had a consultant as a partner on this effort. That is Alexis Smith from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. They were the city's partner in 2019 and worked on the market analysis at that time. And they have come back to assist us on both this and our MBTA 3A compliance. And as part of this effort, Alexis has taken significant efforts to revisit the analysis that was done in 2019 and make sure that it reflects our current market conditions. Just to mention, MAPC's participation was grant funded, and Alexis Smith of MAPC is here tonight and is running the slides, and I'm going to turn it over to her to walk through the specific policy recommendations that are included in the draft ordinance, how she reached those conclusions. So thank you, Alexis.
When the city planning staff first approached us to come back and be involved again in the inclusionary zoning analysis for Salem, the city's goals were to confirm and, if needed, update the previous recommendations from the 2019 analysis based on the current market conditions, which there's a lot that's changed in the world of housing in the years since 2019 and today. As Elena previously mentioned, a big piece of that was to make sure that any of the future policy was well documented, or the analysis of the proposed policy was documented and would satisfy all state requirements, so that the policy, if adopted, would be accepted by the state to apply in a future 3A district. And again, final goal being to draft the language which is here before you tonight. Just some very quick background on this current iteration of the project. We began work on this over the summer. The first piece involved looking at really setting the market context, which I'll get into later on in the presentation. We spent a fair amount of time running the feasibility analysis, which is the most complicated part, and then double checking compliance. My organization MAPC has been in regular contact with the state, just about in general, to make sure that what we're doing is going to be very consistent with what the state is looking for in terms of 3A compliance for inclusionary policies. And throughout the process, we've met with the Affordable Housing Trust just as a gut check to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with the city's goals and the housing roadmap. And then that brings us to this meeting this evening. So just some update from the analysis that we previously did. Again, as you all know, there's a lot that's happened in the past 4 years with the pandemic, with housing market changes. But I just wanted to give a very high level overview of the things that impact the analysis. A couple of key changes since when we looked at this, the constructing a policy 4 years ago. There has unsurprisingly been an increase in construction costs. That is happening region-wide, statewide, nationwide. One surprising piece is that construction costs actually didn't increase quite as substantially in Salem as we have seen throughout the region. So that's a good side. It means that that's less of a burden on developers. Rents, you will not be surprised by this. Rents have increased pretty substantially in Salem. That is not a trend unique to the city. That's something that we're seeing region-wide, nationwide. And the third major piece that is impacting our findings this time around is that financing costs have also increased pretty substantially. As you all are aware, interest rates are now double what they were when we did the analysis in 2019, and they're at their highest since 20 years. And so all of these factors together mean that the rents are the blue plus signs mean that the increase in rent means that projects might be that helps developers. The yellow, the orange negative signs are things that kind of make projects harder to develop. So all that is kind of taken together means there's a little bit of a mixed bag, but the development on the whole is a little bit harder now than when we last looked at the market context 4 years ago. And again, just big takeaways to the punchline up front is that for larger projects, which we're defining in the range of 25 units, 20 or 30 units, in general, the 2019 proposal remains feasible. The increase in rent was enough to offset the increase in interest rates and construction cost increases. So that's great news. For smaller projects, feasibility was a little less certain. Smaller projects were defining as, again, less up to 20 or 25 projects. Smaller projects in general, in any municipality, in any market, are more difficult to make work. You still need somebody on site managing the project. You still need to apply for loans. You still need to do all the things that you would do for a 40 or 50 unit project, but you're only getting the returns for 12 or 15 units, or however the case may be. And we, based on permitting data and also just based on interviews that we've done with local developers, I should have mentioned that earlier. As part of this project, we interviewed 8 local developers, both for-profit and nonprofit, just to gut check all of the updated data that we're pulling and make sure that what we're doing is really, truly accurate to Salem's market specifically. What we've heard is that smaller projects are really the bread and butter for Salem's downtown. Salem is not a municipality that sees huge, 100-unit buildings, but it sees a lot of, essentially small, what we call missing middle, small apartments, really infill development. And that's the hardest kind of development to make work. And it is the kind of development that's very important in Salem. And so we wanted to be very sensitive to making sure that any policy would not impede development or would not impede projects at that level. Let's see. Here we go. So the proposal, the proposal, like the previous proposal, calls for 10% affordability in projects 21 units or larger. And this is a change from the previous proposal. It calls for 8% affordability in projects up to and including 20 units. And again, that's to reflect the fact that these smaller projects are just a lot, they're harder to make work. And we want to make sure that any policy that Salem is looking at is not going to scare those projects away. These small projects that would be where the proposal is for an 8% affordability would still be required to pay the fractional fee, which we're going to get into in a moment. And so they are absolutely still providing affordability. It's just at a slightly lower level than the larger projects that are easier to make pencil. And I should have said this earlier. In any project that creates 6 or more new residential units would be subject to the proposal. The second major piece of this is that the required level of affordability would households earning 60% of the area median income, which is the median for the entire greater Boston region. And it's a number set by HUD at the national level. And I want to get into this in a little bit more detail. In the very extensive engagement process that MAPC and conducted in partnership with the city in 2019, what we heard loud and clear from focus groups, from city leadership, from repeatedly was that Salem is a lower income community than the region as a whole, and so what would typically you'd see in an inclusionary zoning policy would be 80% AMI, which is what is considered low income. That is the most common income targeted by an inclusionary policy throughout the region. But what we heard time and time again was like, that just doesn't meet Salem's needs. And we underscored the importance of any inclusionary policy adopted by the city should really be serving the local residents. And I know this was repeated again in a subsequent housing policy and planning the city has done. So as I've been talking, you've had a chance to read this. In general, 60% of area median income, you can see that it's about $62,000, just over $62,000 for a one-person household, and increases from there, is roughly comparable to what Salem's median is. And so, again, that was kind of the guiding light, both previously and now, to really make sure that this policy was responsive to local need. A few other pieces of the policy that are that I'm very excited about. The policy would require that the affordability be met through on-site units. Many policies throughout the region allow developers to either build affordable units off-site or to pay a fee instead of building any affordable units at all. And the city felt very strongly that as an equity issue, as the way to build the greatest number of affordable units as quickly as possible. It's really important that all developers provide the housing on site at the same time that they're building market rate units. And so again, this is getting into the no in lieu payment, which is a pretty progressive aspect of this proposal. Another really interesting piece is that is a separate issue from not allowing the affordable units to be the affordability requirement to be satisfied by paying in lieu fee. There is a requirement for a fractional payment. So if, for example, and we'll get into this example, or we'll get into some specific examples a little bit later on, but, there are often fractions of units required. For, in a 50 unit project with a 10% affordability, in a 51 unit project with a 10% affordability requirement, that doesn't pencil out, that doesn't, calculate out to an even number of units. And in that case, the policy would require developers to pay a fraction of the cost of an affordable unit, so that, it really evens out the curve. A lot of times what you will see is developers, understandably, they will build 1 unit fewer. They will propose 1 unit fewer, that 1 market rate unit fewer than what would trigger the requirement for an additional affordable unit. And this really evens that curve and ensures that even if a developer opts to do that, which is their right, they're still paying that fraction of a unit, so that the Affordable Housing Trust can then use those funds to support the creation of additional affordable units. And again, I can get into the specific calculations if you'd like. For example, in a 24 unit project at 10%, that's 2.4 units. So as you can see, that would result in a fee just over $143,000. That fee is based on a number that's set by the state in their qualified allocation plan, which is released every 2 years. We went with this number because it's a benchmark that automatically updates. The city does not have to make any decisions, does not have to update the ordinance. It's just tied to a number that the state will always re-release as time passes. So the other side of this is all of this stuff that the city, all the public benefit that the city will be getting from this policy. But in exchange, any good inclusionary policy that is not going to negatively impact development has to offer trade-offs. There's cost offsets. The more an inclusionary policy asks for, the greater the cost offset has to be. This is kind of the reason why we do the whole financial analysis to begin with. If a city asks for too much, then developers won't be able to build anything, and no housing will get built, affordable or otherwise. So it's really critical that any inclusionary policy balance its asks with cost offsets, so that you reduce the risk of increasing market rents to compensate for the affordable units, and you reduce the risks of development not happening at all. So to offset the cost of these kind of deeper affordable units at 60% AMI, the proposal allows for a 25% housing unit bonus, or an increase in the amount of housing units that can be built on any particular lot. As part of this, it would also allow for an increase in the number of stories allowed, but not an increase in the allowable height in the underlying zoning district. We can get into that in a little bit more detail if you in the questions section, if you'd like. The second piece of that is allowing a parking reduction of up to 1 parking space per unit when combined with other measures that will reduce the need for more than 1 car per household. Both of these are really important pieces. And both of these are necessary to achieve that 60% AMI. This is one of the things that we looked at both in 2019 and again in the current analysis, that if the city's goal is to serve 60% AMI, then this is the level of cost offset that is sufficient to support that. And just as an aside, both of these 2 pieces of cost offsets, a housing unit bonus and a parking reduction, are 2 of the most common cost offsets in inclusionary policies throughout the state. So this is something that developers will understand. Finally, previously, I'd spoken a little bit about how important it is to make sure that smaller development of the kind that's happening, a lot in Salem is really supported. Another important piece of Salem's development context, or Salem's market context, is adaptive reuse. It's as you all know, you don't need me to tell you it. It's a great tool. It keeps it helps maintain character of the neighborhood. It's great for sustainability to use existing building shells. It's something the city has worked really hard to support. And the city was very clear about, not wanting to risk any inclusionary policy, making it more difficult to do adaptive reuse, which is already a difficult thing to do. And so to make sure that any inclusionary policy would not negatively impact adaptive reuse, there are a couple of provisions that will allow a developer to seek additional relief, both through the special permit that will allow for affordability at a slightly higher level if the 60% AMI would truly negatively, impact a developer's ability to do an adaptive reuse project. And secondly, in the central business district, the adaptive reuse projects could provide parking spaces of down to no parking spaces per unit. I've been speaking, and in the examples, I probably will speak in this in terms of rental, but just a quick flag that this policy would also apply to home ownership units. 60% AMI is a little bit tricky for home ownership units. It can be, depending on the climate and the eligibility of local residents, a little bit more difficult to find buyers who are qualified for a mortgage at that income level. And so the policy also includes a mechanism to, if a developer simply can't find a buyer at the 60% AMI level, it includes a mechanism for the developer to sell the unit to a slightly higher income. And we're wrapping up the presentation, but just to give you an idea of what this will look like as it plays out on the ground. As an example, take a developer comes in with a proposed 32-unit building. Under the proposed policy, the developer would be required to provide 10% of those units as affordable. So that's 3 affordable units within the building that they'll be constructing, plus an additional 0.2 of a unit fractional payment. If we then bring in the housing unit bonus, that allows for up to an additional 8 bonus units, so 40 units total. But those 40 units would still be subject to the same 10% affordability requirement. So now you end with a building that is a total of 40 units with 4 affordable units built on site as part of that development. For a smaller example, in a 12-unit building, say, 12 units times 8% affordability would equal 1 affordable unit exactly. Adding in the 25% housing bonus, that would allow for 3 extra units, so 15 units total. And in that case, there would be a fraction of a unit allowed. So the developer would ultimately be providing 1 affordable unit plus 0.2 of a unit fractional fee, which currently would work out to about $70,000. That would go to the Affordable Housing Trust and be used for affordable housing programs. So that is a very, there's a lot of information. It's a lot of numbers, but I will happily take any questions as you see fit. And thanks so much again.
Alexis? Sorry. I was going to go first to see if the councilors had any questions for Alexis before we opened it up to public comment or the planning board questions. Councilor Merkel and then Councilor Hapworth.
Thank you, President Stott. First, I do want to start by saying I welcome this coming before us, and to ensure affordable units are included in market rate developments. I know this has been worked on for a long time. It's based on all the extensive research. I've really appreciated this presentation. As we all know, the government hasn't been building affordable housing for decades, and we need to work with the private sector, to take every action we can for the affordable housing crisis and the housing crisis in general. I do appreciate, too, the focus on making it work for smaller projects so they can pencil out as well. So I did have a question on the housing, the cost offsets, the housing unit bonus. I found it interesting. I think you had mentioned that it will also help it will have an effect on the rents in the market rate. I was wondering if I understood that correctly, because I find that really interesting, to explain what benefit the bonus is and, how that affects that, just a little clarity. I was trying to take notes as quickly as I could. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Alexis, we'll take a first pass at this here in the room, and then please add any additional context. The housing bonus functions by allowing additional units to be built. There's a couple of benefits to that, but one is that in these kinds of developments where we are relying on market rate development to provide affordable housing, those subsidized rents, you need to make up that return for the developer somewhere else, and by allowing them to build additional units, you allow for hopefully not a compensatory increase in the market rents in the development, so that we would have more units at more reasonable rents overall, including the affordable rents. And I just want to also add, with the housing bonus, another sort of positive to that is that we might get more affordable units overall, since the affordability is calculated based on the total number of units. Alexis, anything to add?
No, I think you summed it up very well. I guess if I implied that that this policy would in any way increase market rents, I apologize. That was the intent, was the exact opposite. I think the reason for the housing bonus, housing unit bonus, is specifically to ensure that that market units do not increase. As Elena said, there's developers taking less profit and less income when they provide affordable units, and so the additional market units ensure that they aren't trying to make up for that loss of profit by increasing market rate rents.
Great. Thank you. I think that's an interesting, benefit of that to look at as well. With that, how that will affect all the rents, and which, at every price point, we know we need to stabilize rents. So I find that helpful, and thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Councillor Hapworth and Councillor Watson-Felt.
Thank you all, and echo Councilor Merkel's comments about just appreciating seeing this back before us again here today. Elena, you mentioned earlier about the B5 being excluded until we can do an EFA. I think I must have missed that in reading through this. Can you explain? Can you go into a little more detail on the B5 and the feasibility analysis around that?
Sure. So the specific reference in the draft ordinance is section 5.4.2, subsection 4. And the reason for that carve out is like we mentioned earlier, we're sort of going through two simultaneous processes. We have inclusionary housing that we're trying to advance. At the same time, we are trying to ensure that the City of Salem is compliant with the MBTA Communities Law. The B5 district has been identified as an existing district that allows multifamily housing development by right, and as such, we have submitted an application to the state through the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities to accept that determination. As part of that application, MAPC has assisted the city in creating an economic feasibility analysis that shows that the proposed inclusionary housing policy does not meaningfully impair and thus make not by right multifamily housing development. And so essentially, Alexis can speak to the form of the EFA and what's included in that analysis. But the point that I was really trying to draw apart earlier was that the market analysis that was done to identify the elements of the inclusionary housing policy draws from the same source as the economic feasibility analysis, because we're generally looking at the question of what level of affordable housing can market rate development in the city, and for MBTA communities law compliance, specifically within the B5, support without dampening development. Does that answer the question?
Okay, I think I understand. So so because our B5 is our zone that we've identified, this is not necessarily initially going to apply to this, but we believe that the formula and the math that goes into this ordinance will apply to this. It's coming from the same source. Is that correct? How I understand that?
Yes.
So I guess the thought is, at the end of the day, there isn't much we could change about the math here to make it comply with state law. Is that correct? I
would rephrase it in that we believe that We believe that the B5 with the inclusionary housing policy adopted would be compliant, but to ensure that we give the state its due and allow it to sort of act first and respond to our application, we want to delay adoption of inclusionary housing being implemented in the B5 until such time that they give us the go-ahead.
When do we expect that answer from the state?
We don't have a timeline from the state. We've submitted the application for compliance back in May. No community has been in the Commonwealth has been identified as in compliance yet. And so this is a new legislation. They're still working through it. But as Alexis has stated, we have been in very close contact with the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. They know about this ordinance. They know it's coming. We shared this language with them, and they said that was okay with them.
Okay. Okay. I mean, that makes sense to me. I think it confuses the issue a little bit, unfortunately. Like, I think that it's a very clear story to say that this is something that we're passing today to comply with this so that we can get inclusionary zoning. I understand it's a two-step process. I guess it's just unfortunate that beyond our control, but it's still unfortunate that we're not in a position where we have all that information right now as we're making this decision. But thank you.
Councillor Watson-Felt.
Thank you. So just as a clarifying point on that, this policy would affect the B5 until it doesn't.
Actually, I would say the complete opposite.
Opposite. Okay. It does not affect the B5 until it does.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Another clarifying question just about this idea of the bonus affecting, or I guess the density bonus potentially sharing the load of the cost of the balance. That would be great, but we have absolutely no guarantee of that, do we? So, like, a developer could rent at whatever rate they'd like to rent at regardless. So they could make up the balance and then some and set their own pricing. There's no restriction, right? There's no rent control in Salem.
That is accurate.
Right. So it's nice to consider that it would theoretically share the balance, but we have no guarantee of that.
No guarantee outside of market forces, which would sort of it would be in a developer and operator's best interest to place their market rents at such a level that folks would rent from them. And there is, thankfully, competition, which we hope would prevent any kind of deep rent gouging at a specific development. But you're right that there's no current mechanism that exists to allow the city of Salem to locally regulate our market rents.
Correct. So I just wanted, for the public's awareness, it's important to understand that the density bonus could theoretically share the balance, but also may not, at least, depending on what's comfortable for the developer who'll be earning the money. That's what you just said. Yeah, there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, those are market rate rents sent by market force.
Exactly. Thank you. And then speaking of feasibility, I wish I had a better understanding, and this could just be on me not doing enough homework before this meeting, but I would love to understand when we define feasibility for a developer, we're talking about cost versus profit, right? That's what feasibility really is. So what is that percentage profit that helps us to understand feasibility for those of us who are not developers?
Sure. I'm actually going to ask Alexis to help with this one. I know, we look at the internal rate of return, what makes sense for that number. There's a whole bunch of layers to it. So I defer to you, Alexis.
Thank you. There are a lot of different ways that developers look at whether or not a project is going to be profitable enough for them to pursue. You'll hear terms like internal rate of return, or IRR, thrown around, return on cost, return on investment. There are many different metrics that you can use. For this analysis, we used one called, as Amanda said, internal rate of return, or IRR. If you're looking for specific numbers, I can tell you that IRR for development projects varies widely. For a big development, 100, 200 unit development with national investors, a developer might be looking for an IRR of, say, 18%. For a small, 12, 15 unit project that is just, a local outfit who's maybe, putting up their own cash up front to get the project jump started, you might be looking at an IRR of more along the lines of 12%. That latter example is what we're seeing more of in Salem. This was confirmed through, as I mentioned, interviews with several local developers who are locally active. Based on those conversations and also on some industry data that we've pulled, not some, a pretty substantial amount of industry data that we've pulled. We set the target IRR for a baseline project at 14% IRR, which we believe is pretty consistent with what Salem's market is currently generating, or would currently be running. And then we said, okay, if a project without inclusionary zoning is looking for a 14% IRR, and now we add these inclusionary requirements, at this affordability requirement on top of that, that is going to reduce a project's IRR. And so don't quote me on these numbers exactly. We have a write-up that you may have already seen, but in general, an inclusionary requirement of this magnitude, we might say, all right, well, now the IRR goes down to 12%, and that is not feasible. A developer would probably not be willing to move forward with that. It would be way too risky. And so now we are going to add in some of these cost offsets to bring that back up closer to the baseline IRR of 14%. The metrics that we used specifically were to say, all right, we believe that a development project can shoulder a small fraction of this of the burden of affordability and still maintain feasibility. Which is consistent with what we see across the region. And so we have defined feasibility as a change in the internal rate of return of less than 1% for large projects and less than 0.5% for small projects. Again, for the same reasons that I've mentioned before about small projects just being a lot harder to make work. So that was a very long-winded way of saying we're defining feasibility as on the whole, the sum of the affordable units, the cost of the affordable units alongside the benefits of the cost offsets are not going to decrease a project's IRR by more than 1% for large projects and more than 0.5% for small projects. I don't know if that was the answer you're looking for. I can also talk less, do a less numbers-based discussion if that's what you were hoping for.
That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you very much. I do have another question. This is more for our planning team, and thank you for that, Alexis. I know there's a lot of numbers, but I did track them, and I really appreciate you running through them. From a development perspective, we're talking about this bonus. The concerns that have been raised just about our physical built environment is obviously for new buildings, not infill for the most part, is so more units, but not more height necessarily. In our current, and this is just for the public's awareness, in our current formulating of all of our boards and commissions and approval processes inside the B5 around the SRA and out around the whole area, the city, what are the ways around that? What are the appeals processes, the relief available to developers? How would a developer who was looking for an additional level of height, for example, or even a further reduction of a parking requirement, how would they maneuver through our boards and commissions to get that approved?
Sure. So again, the ordinance was crafted in a way to try to avoid that, to make sure development would be feasible without the need for a variance or a special permit. There are unique cases where a project can't meet the zoning ordinance due to a hardship of the property. In that case, a developer can request a variance. For example, if there was something unique about the property and they couldn't meet a height restriction, they could apply to the Zoning Board of Appeals for a variance from that dimensional standard. That goes through a public hearing process that's heard at the Zoning Board of Appeals. Butters are notified. It is in the newspaper. There's a public hearing just like this where members of the public can come and speak, and then the zoning board deliberates and makes findings on whether there's a hardship. There's also a special permit process, which is a little bit different, where the specific findings that are made, such as, neighborhood quality and stuff like that, depending on what the dimensional standard is that's being requested, what kind of relief is being requested. But again, this ordinance was crafted that a typical development wouldn't need to go through that special permit or variance process.
Great, thank you.
Councilor Marcillo, Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you, President. Just to follow up on the B5 zoning. So this ordinance was written using that feasibility study, which showed that with the bonus density, with the height, with the extra story, or the parking, that it minimized the impact on the IRR, right? Okay. So since the feasibility study has shown that, then we've shown that it would not negatively affect the creation of new housing, right? So is there any reason to believe that the state would not accept this and make it the law for B5 also in Salem if we choose to adopt it?
Salem is comfortable with the feasibility study and MAPC's work in it. The state has specifically said that only qualified third-party reviewers that are approved by the state are allowed to do that study, and it's done by a specific methodology that's approved by the state. And so that was done. The MAPC is an approved third-party consultant that the state said is qualified to do this work, and they did it based on the methodology. So we feel confident in that economic feasibility analysis.
Okay. And we currently request, we do not force developers to include affordable units in their projects, right? And so just getting back to the impact on rents that they ask for when they provide affordability, is there any reason to believe that creating affordable units in a new development has negatively impacted the market rate rent that they're asking for, or even the price if they're condos? Have you seen like a significant increase because they're creating those affordable units?
Alexis, that's another one I'd like to defer to you on, because I know you've talked to developers about this. We implement the policy, but then I haven't gone back and talked to the developers. So we've had someone who's done those interviews.
So the caveat is that rents have been increasing in every municipality across the region, and that is independent of the adoption or application of any inclusionary or affordability requirements. And so it's very difficult to say, yes, rents have increased since we started implementing these requirements or asking for this level of affordability. I can tell you that we're doing these because of the MBTA communities. We're doing these studies in municipalities across the region, and municipalities that have had the zoning in place for 20 years are still seeing rents increase. So I don't think we can correlate any increase in rents to a policy specifically. I would also say, in general, a developer is going to charge the maximum amount of rent that they can get for a property. If a developer builds something, regardless of whether or not there are affordable units there, if they can charge, if they could charge $4,000 a month for that unit, they would. It's their business. But in Salem, they probably can't in most cases. And so, they're charging what the market will bear. Within that, there's some wiggle room, which is partly what which is what the housing unit bonus and the cost offsets are meant to address. I would say the cost offsets serve as much, if not more so than they serve to stabilize market rents, but they also just make sure that the development moves forward at all. Development is what we've heard, especially from the small outfits that are operating, only in Salem or in the very small footprint, these small projects. They're saying, their margins are already very, very, very slim. And any small thing could put them over the edge from not moving forward at all. And so the cost offsets are as much for just making sure that the developer doesn't walk and say, we can't develop in Salem at all. I think that, another benefit is making sure that they don't try to increase beyond like that, add that extra $50 a month, add that extra $100 a month, to make sure that they've got their safety cushion. But it's, in general, a developer is already kind of charging, they're already pushing what the market can bear and they're asking for as much as they can generally get. And so the cost offsets kind of make sure that they're not going to try to push that any further, while also making sure, a couple steps earlier that the development will proceed at all. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Councilor McCarthy, and then back to you, Councilor. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I call Councilor McCarthy after Councilor Marcillo, and then Councilor Cohen, and then Councilor Hapworth. We all good? Okay, Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you, Chair. Couple quick questions. So with the new transit zone, the inclusionary zone is going to mirror the transit zone, the B5, so that it's not going to be anything outside of the B5 for the inclusionary housing zone?
So inclusionary housing, if adopted, would apply citywide. The zone to meet compliance with the MBTA communities law would just be the B5 once the economic feasibility analysis is adopted, or is accepted rather.
Okay. Current project already permitted, awaiting funding, whatever. We adopt inclusionary zoning. Can they go back and try to increase their project based on applying for the inclusionary zoning, for looking for a density bonus, or would they have to go back and restart their whole permitting process back from square one?
Let me think about that.
Because we know you can't zone backwards, but now all of a sudden we're gonna. So if someone has a project in the work and you pass a zoning that's going to affect their project negatively, you can't do that. They'll say that I applied under the rules that I applied. Now you have a project that's been permitted, it's in place, waiting to put a shovel in the ground, and this body passes this. And does that then in turn make that project available to now take up this tool in the toolbox and increase their density, or what's the process for them going back?
Sure. So any project can apply for an amendment. They could go through, if it's a site plan review, let's say, they would need to go through the process essentially over again if you're applying for an amendment, because that changes the whole project. When you're increasing the number of units, we need to make sure that there's enough sewer and water capacity, so the planning board will still take a look at that. For any project 6 units or more, it would require an amendment.
Okay.
You're changing that, which requires a new public hearing, a new decision, a new appeal process.
Which I guess that's my question. Do they go back to square one? Because if they're looking, and if this now tool becomes available to them and they look for an amendment, are they going all the way back to the initial filing, or are we just looking, they're going to try to take an amendment and are we creating a fast track route for them to take this on? I'm just worried about a project that's already been through an extensive process, and now there's another tool available. Is there a moratorium, or is there a time limit on any project that was already permitted within X amount of time? They're not allowed to do this. Those are just questions I'm throwing out. The planning board's going to hear this after us. My second question is, what happens when you have a project that's fewer than 20 units, say 18, 17, and then you go for your density bonus and throws you up to 21. Then you're required to hit 10%, or are you still required to hit 8%?
Sure. So for that first part, again, I want to say the project has the opportunity to come in for an amendment if they like. But an amendment depends on the scope of the project, but an amendment is looked at essentially with fresh eyes, looking at, does it meet the site circulation? Is there adequate landscaping? Is there adequate sewer and water flow? Is there adequate circulation? So it's not, I would say it's the planning board would still do a thorough job, as would city staff, evaluating that to make sure we're still meeting the site plan review criteria. In terms of once you increase it, Alexis, I know we talked about this, and I want to make sure I get it right. My understanding is it'd be the 10%, because now you're over 20 units.
Yes, that's the way it's written.
No, the bonus is that you have the 17 units, you have a bonus, that's your total number of units, and then you do 10% on that 21.
And just one last one, because this came up the last time probably one of a handful of people that was, other than you, that were in this room back then. This came up when you talk about the distance from the commuter rail station. How is that calculated? Because I remember the last time we drew a circle and then it hits the edge of one piece of property. Does that make it all, you know what I'm saying? How is that calculated? Or is it just, are we getting away from that because now we're just saying it's the B5 and what are the defined boundaries of the B5? That's what it is.
I want to go to that second point first, that the inclusionary housing will apply citywide. So it is citywide, it is not just the B5. So I just want to clarify that. And then again, the ordinance does specify how it's measured, and I'm going to let Elena answer that.
So that is network distance, and so that means by roadways. So how would you access a site?
Okay. So it's by roadways. So you go in to do your Google Maps and you're going to say, I'm starting at the MBTA station and I'm going to pick a point. I don't care where it is. And if that, Pickering Wharf, there you go. Thank you. So you pick Pickering Wharf, boom. And Pickering Wharf is, now you have to define the entrance, or is it, if it hits one building, it takes them all in? You know what I'm saying? Because now you got a piece of property that may fall into the boundary or a portion of it, but does it affect the entire property? Or if it just hits one aspect of it?
Sure. So
this came up the last time.
So I was not there for the previous review of inclusionary housing. I will say so I'm so sorry. I was thinking about MBTA communities. So this is talking about the half-a-mile radius that relates to the potential parking reduction. What properties would be eligible? My understanding would be a property that is included within, like any property that is touched by that radius would be eligible for inclusion. And I just want to be very clear, the reason that it is street network related is that the hope is that if you are within half a mile of a transit station, we know that the B5 district is particularly walkable. We would hope that with other transportation demand measures, we could incentivize people to engage with the city of Salem outside of a car. But to answer your question directly, any property that is touched within that half-a-mile radius would be eligible for inclusion, provided they offered other transportation demand management methods to reduce their parking ratio relative to their residential units.
Councilor McCarthy, are you good?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll throw it out.
Into the mic so we can hear you. Thanks.
How close is Shetland Properties to the MBTA station? Because I know they're going to be coming in at some point with their project and they're playing their cards close to their vest. But if any part of their property is within half a mile of a transit station, then if they're going to come in here to this body, which I won't be sitting in, but if someone's going to come in here and say, well, we can reduce our parking requirement by whatever, because now we fall into this zone, that's not going to cut it. There's just a statement and a question. That's more of a statement, I guess, because the potential there is to create a whole bunch of units with not a lot of parking in the most densely populated neighborhood in the city. So that's just, I'll throw that out there. That's something to consider.
Amanda's going to reply. Did you reply to that, Amanda?
Yeah, and I do want to note for that particular project, what's been discussed as part of that vision and study and those developers that had talked to the community about their project, what they had been throwing out there as options would all require a zoning amendment. So even with inclusionary housing, for what the level of units that developer has talked about will require a zoning amendment. And at that point, the parking can be established, the height, the number, the density, all of that would go through a separate process.
So a change in zoning would therefore not trigger this half mile. So I guess the underlying zoning would still trump or take precedent over the transit zone.
The inclusionary housing ordinance will still apply, but at the same time, the city council will set the units per acre for that site under the zoning ordinance. And so you can consider the inclusionary housing requirements when thinking about those dimensional standards for those really unique one-off projects that would require a zoning amendment.
And I don't mean to single out Shetland. That just comes to the top of my head. There's a couple other projects that are in the downtown that have already been permitted that make me just scratch my head a little bit and wonder. So thank you.
I would just like to offer a brief clarification. I may have used the phrase half-mile radius when we were speaking earlier. I want to be very clear that in the ordinance, it does say within a half mile of a commuter station, and that was language that we specifically chose because it does not include the half-a-mile radius, which would be as the crow flies. We are talking again about network access, so half a mile by car, by foot, not a radius. So I just wanted to offer that clarification for the record.
So, are you good, Councilor McCarthy? Okay, can I just do a quick follow-up since we're talking about the commuter rail station? I'm assuming the way it's worded is for a future South Salem station. And at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that Salem is a commuter rail community. Is that why we are not considering bus stops?
So that is part of that conversation. So for purposes of MBTA compliance, we are compelled to locate our multifamily zone, our district of compliance within a reasonable distance from that transit stop, so that existing transit stop. And that was a designation that the state gave to the city of Salem if we're discussing the reasoning for why we are not considering all bus stops within the city of Salem as eligible for parking reduction, that decision was reached because we found that the frequency, the reliability that is provided by proximity to a commuter rail station is viewed as more of an amenity than might be seen with a bus stop. Alexis, if you would like to offer anything else, because I know that you've dug into the numbers, feel free to add.
No, I think you summed it up nicely. I don't have anything to add to that. Thanks.
Okay. Councillor Cohen, and then Councillor Watson-Phillips.
Thank you, President Stott. I have a couple of comments and a question. I've spoken with a couple of developers who are either developing or attempting to develop property in Salem, and also trying to do the same in Somerville and Cambridge. And although I'd like a more robust percentage, their percentage is high enough where they're discouraged from building in those two communities. Also, my primary concern is existing residents who are being displaced, and unfortunately, our ability to help them has been stifled by legislature not letting us deliberate on condo conversion so far, and our city's lack of enforcement on illegal short-term rentals. And so this leads to my question, because I do believe that our diminishing rental stock is really the thing we need to address most. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, because I do personally believe that a density bonus and variance on parking, especially where the footprint is remaining the same and the height, is that it will create more naturally affordable units. So more units that are affordable and smaller units will be more naturally affordable. And just wanted to see if that jives with your thinking and MAPC's.
Alexis, do you want to take that one?
the particularly with the structure of the housing unit bonus, the way it interacts with the height regulations, I think I can't speculate as to what developers may or may not choose to do on a given parcel, but I think you're correct in that would perhaps prompt developers when they're able to, maybe make a smaller unit and build the ability to build a few extra smaller, units on the site that will likely be more naturally affordable. I don't want to use capital A affordable because, market rate housing is market rate housing. But there are different kinds of market rate housing, market rate housing at all different price points. And I think you're right that the more multifamily housing that's built, that is going to tend to be more affordable market rate housing than, a larger single family house or whatever. So that a long-winded way of saying, yes, I concur with your assessment.
And I would also briefly add to Councillor Cohen's point that the inclusionary housing ordinance that's before you all tonight is one of, as Amanda mentioned, 30 strategies that the city has identified to possibly respond to our affordability crisis that's felt both by folks that would like to be residents of Salem, but also residents that are currently here. Councillor Cohen called out the condo conversion ordinance. There's also an identified strategy for pursuing anti-displacement measures citywide. So these are, again, conversations that we're having at the citywide level, and inclusionary housing is one element of many that we hope to use to respond to what we know is a housing crisis, both here in the city, in the Commonwealth, and in the broader country.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McLean, then Councillor Hapworth, then we can get to the planning. Oh, Councillor McLean has not spoken yet. So Councillor McLean, then Councillor Watson-Felt.
Just tell him to ask my question.
Thank you. I have a few questions. I'm going to give you a softball question, sort of anticipation of public comment, and just ask you to speak to a little bit about the way these affordability restrictions are enforced, both for purchasers and for renters. Like, how does this get created? How is it maintained? How does it move forward in perpetuity?
Sure. So the developer, before they are allowed to get their certificate of occupancies, we are in touch with them very early on to start working on if it's an affordable ownership unit, a deed rider, if it's a rental unit, there's a regulatory restriction on the property. We work on that language with the state and the city solicitor, and it's a deed restriction on the property for the units to be affordable. We do require those units to be floating throughout the property, and if they're rentals, if they're ownership, they are set units. And so if a tenant leaves that unit, if another unit becomes available, it just makes the flow easier when they're floating units. The state requires what's called an affirmatively furthering fair housing action plan or marketing plan, an affirmatively fair housing marketing plan. There are very set standards in there that we have to follow. Salem goes above and beyond that because we found that the goal of that plan is to cast a very wide net. And we want to make sure that net is cast wide and far. Salem requires our marketing plan and our applications to be bilingual. I think we are the only community in the Commonwealth that requires that. We also have our local resources that we send it out to. We send it out to throughout our networks. We always ask the city councilors to also push these units available when they become available. The property owner has to hire what's called a lottery agent. They are certified by the state. That lottery agent identifies what the maximum rent will be, including utilities, and then that maximum rent gets both approved by the state and the city to make sure that they're meeting the guidelines. Let's see, the lottery agent holds a informational session for people who are interested in applying, to let them know what the process is for the application, how to apply for it, when the application is due by, and then they essentially hold a lottery when they pull the application out. If the application is pulled, then they go through the income eligibility requirements to make sure that the household is meeting that income requirement, the 60% area median income. And then As those units become open, if a tenant leaves, then the property owner goes through the process again, marketing the unit based on the affirmative fair housing marketing plan. Ownership are a little bit different. Again, there's a deed rider, it's a deed restriction. There's, in the ordinance, as you saw, a term in which we require it to be marketed at 60% of the area median income. But for ownership units, there is a 10% window of availability, which means that the rent or the mortgage, I shouldn't say the mortgage, the max sale price, excuse me, the max sale price has to be set 10% below what the max household income size is. So if we say 60% area median income is the targeted household, the maximum rent is set at 50% AMI. So we cast a wider net to get folks who are eligible. Again, if we can't get somebody, if the property owner cannot find somebody who qualifies for a mortgage within that time frame, then they could bump that up to 80% AMI, which is really at a 70% max sale price. I know that's a really lot of information, so I'm happy to go through any of that in more detail.
No, thank you. I think that was good. With the understanding that we're talking about multifamily housing, I think this is the kind of question that I get, since I have a lot of single family housing. People will go, are you controlling what I can sell my individual house for? So it's helpful to have an understanding of what we're talking about. My next question is relative to the fractional payments. I understand that we're not doing payments in lieu, but we had a lot of conversation about fractional payments. And my question was, is there sort of a floor for when fractional payments are created versus when a unit is created? So for example, if I pick a number out of a hat, say I'm creating 29 housing units, right? And so I go at a 10% rate and that gets me to 2.9. Am I now as a developer paying a fee based on that 0.9, or is it like, no, you've got most of a unit, like build the unit?
Yeah, so the ordinance gives the developer the option. Anything under one whole unit, they have the option to either build the unit or pay the fractional payment. So if it's 0.9, they could pay the 0.9% of the unit.
Okay. And a couple more questions. This all pretty concrete, I think. Relative to the parking reduction question, we have this in one of our incentives is being able to reduce the parking requirement. It was sort of specifically noted that potentially for adaptive reuse in the B5 district, that parking could be reduced to 0. Is there any floor under that for inclusionary housing for the rest of the city, or is it always going to be possible to reduce required parking to 0?
I'm just going to rephrase the question back to you to make sure that I understand, Councilor McLean. So the ordinance, is the question if any property within the city could, under the inclusionary housing ordinance as proposed, reduce their parking ratio to 0 units per residential unit?
Yeah, that's my question.
So no. There's sort of two pathways where you could have a parking reduction. If you were in that half mile of a commuter rail station, you can, Amanda will add on a little information after I take a stab at it. So as I understand, if you're within that half mile network distance from a commuter rail station and you do employ other transportation demand measures, you can reduce your parking requirement to 1 parking space per residential unit. Specifically, we did carve out special accommodation for adaptive reuse properties within the B5 because, again, they're proximal to an existing commuter rail station, as well as we know that another city priority is historic preservation. And so when we can use these sites and put them back into service to serve a housing use while preserving historic elements of the city, obviously that is a win-win. But because those sites are challenging sometimes to reconfigure to allow for the parking requirements that would be otherwise in place, we want to have a special accommodation to acknowledge their broader significance. And Amanda.
Oh, yeah. So the ordinance calls out that the parking, if you are, again, further than half a mile from the commuter rail with transportation demand management. And so that would be something that the applicant has to apply to the planning board and demonstrate I'm going to have commuter rail passes for my tenants or whatever those TDM measures are, and that would be part of the planning board decision as a requirement, then they could reduce it to 1 space per dwelling unit.
They could reduce it to 1 space per dwelling unit, but there's not a situation where they could take advantage of the adaptive reuse situation in B5 elsewhere and say we're going to reduce this to 0 units per residential unit, 0 parking requirements per residential unit.
Not through this ordinance. That would require a variance.
Okay. And my last question is about the B5. You're anticipating state approval that this will be in compliance and will be able to apply to the B5. Let's say worst case scenario and it does not. Do we now end up in a situation where we have deeper affordability incentives citywide than we have in the B5 district, which is kind of like right in the heart of the city? And if so, is there a conversation going on about how to incentivize deeper affordability there if this is not found to be in compliance?
So until this ordinance is passed, the planning board will continue to implement the expectation of 10% of units affordable at 60% AMI. That's an affordable housing policy. Once this ordinance is passed, we're still going to have that conversation with developers and requests that those units in the B5 are also affordable, that we're getting our 10% or 8% if it's less than the 20 units. But we want to make sure that it's, again, financially feasible. So that's why we will be using this ordinance. So we expect that we will still continue to get those affordable units in the B5, but the ordinance wouldn't apply to B5 until we have that state approval.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a pretty hard conversation to have if that happens, right? Like if you apply for state approval and they're like, we find this not to be in compliance, it's then going to be hard to go to a planning board situation and be like, we really think you should still do it, because they're going to say, well, the state just said this isn't really affordable for me, so I don't want to do that, right? So like, do we have other mechanisms, like real mechanisms or incentives that we can put in place? I know that's not what you're anticipating, but that's what's clicking around in my mind.
Sure. Again, we've had many conversations with the state about this. For some reason, they found that this wasn't in compliance. My guess would be it would be a piece of this. So it's something that you need to tweak to get it to be in compliance. Again, it's a solid policy. It's a solid feasibility analysis. So we don't expect to not be in compliance. If we were, it would be an adjustment that needs to be made.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Watson-Feld, did you have a follow-up?
I do. My first comment, I think, was actually more for Councillor McCarthy, where when he began to speak earlier, it sounded like we were talking about one thing and then we ended up talking about something else. But just to clarify, it sounded as though his original question was, within the networked half-mile distance, if a parcel was large enough to have multiple separate buildings with multiple units in it, the parcel would not be subdivided if the other half of the parcel was outside that 0.5, right? Like the parcel is the parcel and everything on the parcel would apply.
That is correct.
Thank you. I do have a second question now, though, having to do with the historic renovation project reference. Knowing as well as we do that there's not historic districts, right, under which a lot of our properties would have to comply with the preservation requirements of the Historical Commission. How are we defining historical renovation project? Is it going to match the number of years, for example, that the demolition delay does? Is it going to have any kind of structural integrity requirement? Is it going to have any kind of design or shape or height requirement when you say renovation versus preservation? I just want to be sure I understand what the adaptive reuse of historic properties is in this ordinance.
Sure.
Thanks.
For historical renovation projects located in the B5, it's really in the simplest form of the building is being maintained. You are using an existing building. So if you're using the existing building rather than demolition, it is considered an adaptive reuse.
But again, that comes down to percentages of demolition, right? So when we think about it with regards to the demolition delay and what's coming down versus what's staying up, we get really into the details around number of structural walls, interior, like stuff, all that kind of jazz. And I'm just wondering if those considerations that apply in other places are a part of this thinking as well. And if so, is it just consistent? Which seems like the easy answer to me would be to let's be consistent, if it's 100 years and it's whatever, just so that there's some consistency across all of this work. But that sounds like that maybe has not been fully defined.
Yes, so at this point, historic renovation project as used in the ordinance does not have an accompanying proper definition, but that is definitely something that we can take and bring back to you with more specific parameters than around what would comply as a historic renovation project.
Thanks. Yeah, I just think that there are definitely some interested parties in the city that would love to have that defined in some way, shape, or form, just so that we know that we are either in or not in compliance moving forward. Thank you.
Councillor Hepworth.
Thank you. I know we got to get to the planning board and to public comment. So just real quick, just to I guess sum this up for all of us and for folks at home, is it fair to say that that this wouldn't be before us if you didn't believe this was in compliance with state law?
Yes.
Is it okay? In that case, if we were let's say we were to change something in this, if it were around the parking or around the density bonus or around the level of affordability, do you believe that would potentially put us outside of state compliance with state law?
That depends on what's changed. We would have to take a look at that feasibility analysis and make sure that those numbers all still work out.
The only thing that I would add is that inclusionary housing and MBTA communities law have a shared goal, which is the creation of housing, particularly MBTA communities law is the creation of multifamily housing. Here we're talking about some measure of affordable housing. So we think that largely the tweaks that we would see if this were to be revisited would hopefully, because it is a shared goal, be working in tandem. So we don't, it would be, because we don't want to dampen development overall, I don't think we would see tweaks that would negatively impact affordable housing development.
Okay. So if we as a council decided that the density bonus was too large or that the affordability was not deep enough, we would need to look at the math again, and potentially we would be outside of compliance for this, making this feasible within the B5 when we get that passed. Is that, or we would have two separate districts where there's more affordability further from transit than there is close to transit. Is that?
Yeah, I think separating out two separate districts would be very challenging. We'd want to make sure we're in the four corners of this ordinance. In terms of changing the depth of affordability or percentage of affordability, yes, we do need to make sure that we are still working within that feasibility analysis. And if it's working, if it's not working, staff would recommend not making those changes.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor McCarthy, then we can go to the planning board.
Yeah, one last thing, if I may. Just to go back, it says about within a half mile of the transit rail, and we're all under the assumption that, at some point we're going to get a second rail stop. But someone brought up buses. Do we anticipate at some point the state will include the bus routes and there will be a half mile from every bus stop within the city? Because that would pretty much be the whole city.
I just want to understand, is this regarding the MBTA compliance? Mm-hmm. So each community has to have one multi-family zoning district allowed by right. So if the state law were to change to include bus stops, it would be moot to Salem because we already have the requirement through our commuter rail station. And our expectation is that we meet that through the B5 zoning district. So if it did increase, if the state did say, now we're going to include bus stops, or we're going to include or if the city got a second commuter rail station, we would still be in compliance with just that one district.
So if we wanted to add another district based on an additional rail stop, or if the state were to include bus stops, then we'd have to go back through the same process.
No, the city is only required to have one multifamily zoning district by right. And again, we believe that that's the B5. If the city were to have a second commuter rail station, we are still required to only have one multifamily zoning district by right.
But if we wanted to add another one down the road, if we added another station, someone said, hey, we should do what we did over by the station downtown. For South Salem, we want to make another rail stop zone. That would go through some process. It doesn't happen automatically. It would take another process. I know we're compliant with the one by meeting the basic minimum requirements. But if they wanted to add something down the road, it would be a separate process. It wouldn't be, we put in a train stop and, oh, by the way, we just put another train stop in and you get this too.
Sure. So Section 3A of the Mass General Law that updates it actually already has a process in there that allows multifamily zoning by right within half a mile of the commuter rail station. So currently today, a developer could come in and say, I want to rezone this parcel. If it's within half a mile, then it would have to be a simple majority of a vote. It's still a zoning amendment, still goes through the same process any zoning amendment does, but that is a simple majority rather than a super majority. So we don't need a second commuter rail station for that. That process already, any developer can request a zoning amendment. The thing that changes there is the quantum of vote.
Thank you.
Thanks. Chair Grissett?
Thank you very much, Madam President. Members of the Salem Planning Board with questions or comments, Mr. Reeder.
Yes, good evening. So, Amanda, you spoke about measuring distances from the commuter rail station, yet the parking garage is 400 feet long. The parcel is, let's say, 5 acres and over 1,000 feet long. And so the train platform itself is probably 800 feet long. I'm making these observations because I think it becomes hugely important where the measurement is taken from. Is it from the center point of the station on the platform? Is it from any point along the perimeter of the parcel itself? Because I think that gets to Councilor McCarthy's point. If you measure it from essentially the crosswalk to downtown, it does just touch the property of Shetland Park. Or is it perhaps measured along the center line of the railway track itself across all of downtown? So I don't know if you have specificity on that, but I think that's hugely important to quantify it by a developer, by a resident, by anybody.
Thank you, Mr. Reeder. We don't have clarity at that time as to where within the MBTA commuter rail property that is measured from. We'll look into that and then return with that answer.
And one other follow-up question, if I understood correctly, if part of a parcel is deemed available to apply this to, then the entire parcel is. But I think the counterpoint or counter argument is found in how flood overlay or flood maps are applied, so that a portion of a project may be subject to tighter regulations than another part of the project property. So I'm not advocating one way or the other, but when you think about a very large parcel or property, might it be advantageous and worth a consideration to apply this only based on the distance and not by touching just a small snippet of the property and then applied over, say, arbitrarily 100 acres of that same property? So, thank you.
With questions or comments before we turn it back over to City Council. Madam President, I'm not seeing anyone else from the planning board, so back to you, please.
Thank you, Chair Grissett. So now I will open it up to the public for public comment. First, I will call those in the room, since we are both in chambers and appearing virtually this evening. Anyone appearing in favor in the room, you may make your way to the podium. And anyone appearing on Zoom, you can use the raised hand function and we will call you in the order in which the hand was raised. Okay, Madam City Clerk, if you can tell me the first name. Felipe Zamberlini, we will allow you to speak. You just can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Council President Todd, and good evening, members of the Planning Board and City Council. My name is Felipe Zamberlini, 19 Linden Street here in Salem. I also happen to be the chair of the Salem's Affordable Housing Trust Fund Board. And so before I get into the commentary that I actually have, I do want to first and foremost thank Amanda and Elena from Salem's planning team. They've done an outstanding work, especially through the Trust Fund Board, to be able to implement some of those 30 goals that we have, including the one before you all here today, and also to Alexis from MAPC for the outstanding facts that you're sharing about this policy and the amazing feasibility study that MAPC has conducted a second time now for the City of Salem to ascertain the feasibility of this policy, especially in light of the MBTA communities law, to make sure that we are fully compliant with the requirements the state is requiring for all MBTA communities. Now, tonight I am here on my own capacity as a housing advocate, Salem resident, to speak in favor of the inclusionary housing policy. And I'm going to say this really emphasized as drafted before you today. Please don't mess this up. This ordinance will affect us all as a whole city and will help us add one more tool to the toolbox to continue towards creating solutions to our housing crisis. I especially urge the Planning Board to issue a favorable recommendation of this ordinance as written. This has a lot of efforts in this, and it's very thoughtful. It's very intentional, this policy. And to the City Council, I hope that you can have a first and second vote for this proposed ordinance before the end of the year. I believe that is possible, and that is certainly something that would be good for the City of Salem. This inclusionary zoning policy is especially tailored to the needs of the City of Salem, and I urge you to move this policy forward favorably. Now, I do want to focus on a few important principles of this policy in my comments tonight, including the balance of affordability that exists, the benefits of the density bonus, and the importance of this as an added tool to our toolbox. But before I jump into that, I just want to recognize first what this policy isn't. This is not an attempt at killing housing production. Like many folks in the past, especially in this council, have demanded that this policy be by urging for either extremely high percentages of number of units or extremely high depth of affordability that would especially in effect stop any and all housing production in Salem. That's not what this policy is. This is not a policy that will build skyscrapers or significantly disrupt our ability to continue to pursue smart growth. We should be pursuing smart growth on a regular basis. And this is not a silver bullet to our housing crisis. Such thing does not exist. If we're looking for silver bullets, we're going to be stuck here forever. And this is a good, thoroughly planned, and evidence-based approach to tackle some of our housing needs. This inclusionary policy zone is one that strikes a balance with affordability. Typically, inclusionary zoning policies strike a really delicate balance between the financial feasibility of developments based on current and future expected market trends. And the good inclusionary zoning policies require a reasonable percentage of units in new housing developments to be set aside for housing earning less than a certain level of the area median income. And this approach really does make sure that any market rate focused development can still be viable while also contributing to the affordable housing stock of our city, which, by the way, is very low today. Out of the 20,235 year-round housing units as defined by the 2020 census, in Salem today, only 2,569, or just a little bit over 10%, 10.21%, are actually counted towards our subsidized housing inventory. We need to stay above 10%. And this policy is a win-win situation that fosters a harmonious coexistence of diverse income groups in our city and affordability to make sure that we continue to have that SHI, the subsidized housing inventory, above 10.21%, which more often than not, those affordable inclusionary zoning units are eligible to be counted towards. This inclusionary policy also provides reasonable density bonuses. The benefits of the rent density bonuses cannot be overstated. They make those affordable units possible. Reducing it is killing this ordinance. They are a common feature of inclusionary zoning policies. They allow for developments to be built, more homes on a parcel of land than would otherwise be permitted, and support the affordability that's demanded by the policy. In our case, the 10% at 60 or 8% at 60. In essence, this density bonus encourages the creation of affordable housing without curtailing our ability to develop new housing. This is imperative. It's a creative solution, and it promotes both economic growth and social equity at the end of the day. For Salem specifically, it is a balanced approach that allows for small height densities that will allow us to build for the future with heights and number of units that support our housing needs, because we do need to build more housing, period, including affordable and including market rate. And this balances that. Lastly, this inclusionary zoning policy is one more tool in our toolbox. I know this word has been said a few times already tonight, so we can actually tackle this housing crisis. It is one important tool in our toolbox. These IZ policies, or inclusionary zoning policies, leverage private markets for sources of funding and forces to create new affordable units with little or no public subsidy whatsoever, making sure that the feasible projects can move forward, include a balanced approach that does not inherently and definitively require further taxpayer investment to produce both market rate and affordable housing. This is a great thing to have. They provide a huge benefit to a small percentage, indeed small, but a reasonable percentage of low and moderate income households. And if the affordability cost is outweighed by the density bonus, which is the case here before you today, inclusionary zoning can actually lead to more abundant housing for all people. This is something we desperately need as a city and as a region, and we can play a part like many of our neighbors are already doing. This approach will help add one more tool to that toolbox so that we can be having one more important step towards creating solutions to our crisis. This proposal before you today strikes a good balance for Salem. That minimum, and by the way, it is a minimum, developers can do more if they find the ability to do, like many have been able to even in our current system right now. Minimum of 10% for affordable units at 60% for those larger properties, and 8% at 60 AMI for those smaller projects is very important. It's a promising solution to meet the needs of Salem's middle income and market rate housing needs. It balances that affordability. It leverages very reasonable density bonuses and provides a viable strategy to actually tackle our housing crisis instead of just talking about it. I will urge all of you to embrace this opportunity to make Salem a city that truly embodies the spirit of inclusivity and affordability, and implement one of those 30 goals right here before you that we have set forward as a city in our most recent housing production plan, and continue to work together to add more tools to tackle our housing production and affordability needs. I want to thank you all for the time tonight. And once again, I urge those in the planning board to support this ordinance, report it favorably to the council, and those in the council to hopefully vote for this unanimously, because this is a good, important tool to get us away from talking and towards doing something. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. So those on Zoom, if you are here to speak in favor, please use the raised hand function. I will call on those appearing in opposition after we go through those appearing in favor. The next one to speak. I can't hear you, Madam City Clerk. Josh Nagel, you should be allowed to talk. Just unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Josh Nagel, 35 Washington Square, Unit 2. I just want to say I am in favor of this ordinance, and I would like the city to consider potentially incentivizing it further by considering lowering the parking minimum from 1 per unit to less, maybe 0.5 or even 0. Just to attract more investment into the city, to build more units. I just think we need more. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. Many people can't afford to live in Salem. They have to move out. And we should consider making it even more lucrative for people to build here. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Can you just say the name? Next up, we have Katie Hallett. If you'd like to state your name and address for the record, if you wish, and you should be able to unmute yourself and start your comments.
Thank you. My name is Katie Hallett. I'm the convener for the League of Women Voters Salem. I'm at 17 Winter Street, Apartment 8. I'm here to speak on behalf of the League. The League of Women Voters Salem does endorse this inclusionary housing ordinance. Our goal when it comes to affordable housing is access to decent housing and a suitable living environment affordable for all. The League supports programs, policies, and regulations to address the housing needs of low and moderate income families and individuals. Basic human needs must be met before people can participate fully in our democracy. We recognize that the proposed inclusionary zoning ordinance is only one component of a multifaceted plan to resolve the housing crisis. Much more is needed. Fundamentally, we cannot rely on the private sector to fix this public problem. However, we feel it is critical to ensure that specific requirements of affordability are integral to plan development and not a good faith negotiation, which is current practice. The ordinance's components reflect the city's specific needs and were informed by a feasibility study done by the Municipal Area Planning Council, as you've all heard. The goal was to strike a balance between providing the most meaningful affordability for Salem without driving development away with untenable demands. Key components of this ordinance include the number of units. The ordinance would only apply to developments with a net increase of 6 or more units. If the ordinance applied to development projects with fewer units than 6, smaller developments would be faced with a financial burden that could prevent anything other than large projects from moving forward in Salem. This would ultimately, we believe, counteract the need for more housing. Another component is the definition of affordability. The standard definition of affordability is 10% of units at 80% of area median income, which may be adequate in other cities, but would not benefit the majority of Salem residents. For developments of over 20 units, this inclusionary zoning ordinance requires 10% of units to be available to renters or buyers at 60% of AMI. For projects with 20 or fewer units, the ordinance will require 8% of the units to be available at 60% of AMI. Another component is the fractional payments. In the event that a development project has a number of units resulting in a fraction of a unit, for example, 12 units with 1.2 affordable required, the ordinance requires payment into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which would support the city's efforts to maintain and grow city-owned affordable housing. City-owned housing offers deeper levels of affordability and also provides wraparound services in addition to housing. Also, incentives. We appreciate the flexibility in the incentives, particularly with regard to parking reductions. There have been requests to more clearly define the point of measurement from the commuter rail station, and we agree that this would be a good clarifying point. But fundamentally, we feel that reducing the number of required parking spaces will result in deeper levels of affordability. The other enticements to reduce car reliance, such as car sharing benefits, stipends for residents without cars, and public transit passes, are creative solutions to mitigating traffic and improving environmental pressures from increased car traffic. Compliance with Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3A, also an important component of this. The MAPC undertook a feasibility study to ensure that the requirement for affordability doesn't hamper the development of housing by making it too costly to build. This study confirmed that requiring developments of over 20 units to include 10% of the units at 60% of area median income, and developments with 20 or fewer units to include 8% of the units at 60% of the AMI will not impact Salem's ability to attract development projects. In addition, the feasibility study confirmed that this level of affordability would not impact Salem's ability to conform to the new MBTA Communities Act. This recent state legislation requires all communities serviced by public transit and the communities surrounding them to create a by right multifamily housing zone, as previously discussed. Finally, the League of Women Voters Salem enthusiastically endorses the permanence of the ordinance, which does not allow for conversion back to the market rate. Rather, it establishes that the units are designated affordable in perpetuity. We're also firmly in agreement with the provision to ensure the units are equitable and on-site. Reliance on private developers to fully solve the housing crisis will never work, but this ordinance codifies a measure of protection from development geared only towards those who can afford an ever-increasing market rate. It fills a need by expanding housing stock across a range of income levels, and it establishes firm guidelines for affordability. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Next up, we have Judith Riley.
Of 20 West Avenue, Unit 3. I'm speaking in support I'm echoing the comments. I would like to echo the comments of Mr. Felipe Zamberlini and Katie Hallett. I urge you to please pass this ordinance without tinkering with it, because I believe that in this case, speed is of the essence, and in the future, it could be refined. I do appreciate Mr. Nagel's comments on parking, but I hope that this will be passed with all due speed, with perhaps only the clarification of how to measure from the train station. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you for your comment. Next up, we have Jason Sidoriak. I can't hear.
Hi, good evening. And thank you so much for this. My name is Jason Sidoriak with 20 Hathorn Street. I'm also on the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Board. I'm an economist and transportation planner that does a lot of land use planning, particularly for cities across the country that are pursuing vibrant communities that are trying to install large transit systems, medium large transit systems. And one of the things that we look at is the tools that they bring to the table to increase affordability for their housing and their rents. And inclusionary zoning is one of those many tools. And so I am in favor of this ordinance, and it's something that many communities from San Jose, Phoenix, Chapel Hill are pursuing in order to make themselves look more favorable to their own communities, the people who want to be a part of those communities, for funding opportunities. And it's based on a lot of good research that shows that it can help with affordability, as long as additional tools and incentives are with it. If you don't have those additional tools like density bonuses, parking reductions, then there are some unintended consequences. So I do urge that when looking at this ordinance, that you ensure that you can keep those incentives, and then maybe at a later date, just in general, look at some other opportunities to help leverage this ordinance, like eliminating parking minimums, which has one of the biggest impacts, in my opinion, in creating affordability, or at least lowering barriers for developers to create more housing in the community, which is so important, whether it's affordable or market rate, given the housing crisis that we have. So echoing everyone, they had a lot of great points, better than what I can make. So please consider moving this ordinance along. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next up, we have Emmett Costain.
Yes, I'm Emmett Costin. I live at 190 Bridge Street, Unit 3213 here in Salem. I hope this goes through smoothly as soon as possible. I am echoing everyone that came before me, and that we desperately need this to go through. In the future, I'd like to see future zoning revisions, such as parking minimums reduced and increased density allowables, or reviewing R1 zoning. But before that, I'd like to see this get passed as soon as possible. Thank you very much for all of your work.
Thank you for your comment. Next up, we have Killian. If you'd like to state your name and address for the record, you may do so, but you can also unmute yourself and start talking.
Hi, this is Killian O'Connell. I'm also at 190 Bridge Street. So this seems to be a bit of an echo chamber, and I just want to join in. So in consideration of this council, as well as the public's time, I would simply like to urge the council to approve passage of this proposal as quickly as possible. I believe this proposal will be critical for Salem's economic prosperity and social equality. And I also agree with every other person that has spoken before me, as well as Josh Nagel. There are further incentives that can be added to this. That would be great. But simple approval would be excellent. And thank you for everyone's time.
Thank you for your comment. If you still wish to speak, in favor, please use the raised hand function on Zoom. If not, we will move on to those that wish to speak in opposition. Oh, okay, so we'll move on to any members of the public that would like to speak in opposition. Please use the raised hand function on Zoom, and we will call on you to make your comment. You don't see anyone? Okay, I'll do one more call out for anyone appearing in opposition on Zoom land. If you'd like to make a comment, please use the raise hand function. I will also note while we're waiting that the City Council and Planning Board received written comments from Christine Medor, Emmett Costin, the League of Women Voters, Lori Stewart, and Morris Schoof. Full comments, Schaff, thank you. I'm not doing good tonight. The full comments are available at the Planning Board SharePoint site for viewing. Okay. Chair Grissett, any further comments?
Nothing from me. I don't know if any members of the board, I'm seeing heads shaking in the negative, so I would say that's all for this evening, Madam President.
Thank you. Councilor Varela. I apologize if I missed. You're good? Okay. Sorry. Apologies. Okay. Any further comments from the council? Councilor Marcillo.
Thank you, President. I move that the public hearing be closed by roll call vote.
Councilor Marcillo moves that the public hearing be closed by roll call vote. Any discussion? Nope, seeing none. Madam City Clerk, please call the roll that the public hearing be closed.
Council Watson-Felt?
Yes.
Council Varela?
Yes.
Council Prosnewski?
Yes.
Council Marcillo?
Yes.
Council Merkel?
Yes.
Council McLean?
Yes.
Council McCarthy?
Yes.
Council Hapworth?
Yes.
Council Cohen?
Yes.
And Council Stott?
Yes. Thank you. On the question to close the joint public hearing, 10 members voting in the affirmative, 1 absent, matter carries. Councilor Marcillo.
Thank you, President. I move that the matter be referred to the Planning Board for the recommendation by roll call vote.
Councilor Marcillo moves that the matter be referred to the Planning Board for the recommendation by roll call vote. Any discussion? Madam City Clerk, please call the roll.
Council Watson-Felt?
Yes.
Council Varela?
Yes.
Council Prosnewski?
Yes.
Council Marcillo?
Yes.
Council Merkel?
Yes.
Council McLean?
Yes.
Council McCarthy?
Yes.
Council Hapworth?
Yes.
Council Cohen?
Yes.
And Council Stott?
Yes. Thank you. On the question to refer the inclusionary zoning ordinance to the Planning Board for their review and recommendation, 10 members voting in the affirmative, 1 absent, matter carries. Councilor McCarthy? Well,
Planning Board need to adjourn first.
Yeah.
Chair Grissett, if you'd like to close out your board?
Yes, thank you very much. Madam President, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn by Jonathan. Is there a second? Second by Kurt Reeder. Any further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, I will call the roll on the motion to adjourn. Jonathan Burke?
Yes.
Josh Turiel is absent. Zach Counter?
Yes.
Tom Fury?
Yes.
Ellen Sides?
Yes.
Sarah Tarbett?
Yes.
Carol Hamilton?
Yes.
Kurt Reeder?
Yes.
And I vote yes. We are adjourned. Thank you, Madam President.
And before we call for our adjournment, I would just like to say a thank you to Amanda and Elena, and if you're still there, Alexis from MAPC for providing all the information this year. Wow, you get a round of applause. It was that good and concise. So thank you for consolidating down an enormous amount of information for us to be able to digest this evening. Thank you. On that note, Council McCarthy?
Move for adjournment.
Council McCarthy moves for adjournment.
By roll call vote.
By roll call vote. Seeing no discussion, Madam City Clerk, please call the roll.
Council Watson-Felt? Yes. Council Varela? Yes. Council Prosnewski?
Yes.
Council Marcello?
Yes.
Council Merkel? Yes. Council McLean?
Yes.
Council McCarthy?
Yes.
Council Hapworth?
Yes.
Council Cohen? And Council Stott?
Yes. To adjourn the meeting, 10 members voting in the affirmative, 1 absent. We are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.